Hello, this is the vusm 100 review guide. I'm going to be going over this midterm review real briefly, not getting into a ton of detail, but it'll give you an overview of what the exam could look like, and I'm basically going to be reading from the review guide that's posted onto Moodle. So we'll just start in chronological order with the Golly text, and then we'll move into the lens of the course, which would be the box to the right of your review guide. So if we look at Chapter 1, we're just looking basically at a brief overview of what's going on in the context of the story of St. Francis and his life. This was occurring in the medieval times, so this is the late 1100s, early 1200s. We know at this time in Europe there was a lot of war, a lot of friction that was going on between different geographical areas. Of course, this is taking place in Assisi, Italy, which is in the central area to the east, of Rome, and looks much like the Cooley region here, rather hilly in some parts, but divided by large flat spaces of very rich agriculture. St. Francis grew up largely a spoiled rich kid who was popular, charismatic, good-looking, athletic. His dad was a merchant. At the time, it was starting to become a middle class. Before, it was pretty much the nobles and the serfs. And St. Francis's dad has worked his way up as a cloth merchant to become quite wealthy. And St. Francis was able to enjoy some of that new status and class by living near the top of the hill, where the poor people either lived down at the bottom of the hill or certainly outside the city gates. So St. Francis, in his formative years, kind of grew up on his own, in that his dad was on business and traveled a lot, and mom, at the time, of course, was relatively delegated to domestic duties, and she was a rather prayerful person, so she stayed mostly to herself and at home. We also found out that at the time St. Francis wanted to be a knight, wanted to be popular and well known, and so he had two dreams that really affected the early parts of his life. The first dream was a dream telling him that he needed to be a knight and have glory, and so he and a couple other folks decided to go into a battle. That battle occurred in a town nearby. On their journey there, they stopped to sleep. St. Francis had a dream. In that dream told him that he had larger and bigger things to do, to not go to the battle. There was things that were more important to go back. St. Francis immediately woke up that morning and decided not to go to battle, but to return back to Assisi with his friends. St. Francis, now back, was conflicted with what we refer to as hedonism. Hedonism is this behavior of doing things that just make you feel good despite the consequences. And so he was a party boy, and he felt guilty in the morning for a number of reasons. One was he did have an attachment to his Catholic faith through his mom Pica, and St. Francis was in this constant battle of doing things that were hedonistic at night and then waking up in the morning and feeling relatively guilty about it. He decided to go on a trip to Rome, almost like a pilgrimage, and that helped kind of form him a little bit more in a direction away from this hedonistic behavior, but yet again, he still had this tension in this pull, and as he was discerning, trying to figure out what his life meant and what he was supposed to do, he went to a small little church outside the city walls called San Damiano, and prayed to a cross there. That cross, St. Francis believed, literally spoke to him and said, "St. Francis, repair this church, for it is broken." He took that literally and decided to fully invest himself and get married to what he referred to as Mother Poverty. And so he gave away most of his possessions, took his dad's clothing, sold it to repair this church brick by brick. Of course, Dad was not thrilled. They had a lot of conflict about this. St. Francis kind of hid out at the church because it was a safe refuge. His dad came and got him, basically jailed him in their dungeon, and eventually St. Francis broke away from his dad, stripped himself literally naked, and decided to divorce himself from hedonism and materialism and be married to Mother Poverty. So we're kind of now on chapter 3. St. Francis, again, was still conflicted with a dilemma, and this dilemma was how he would go about being married to Mother Poverty, knowing that there was a tension between humility and pride. Humility, humbling yourself to someone else or something else, and the pride of coming from a family of wealth and wanting to be popular. And he still felt this struggle. He dealt with it mostly through lepers, originally rejecting even looking at lepers, to embracing them, hugging them, and even kissing them, which was at the time a powerful symbol to those that were around him. So he had an epiphany, which is a moment of clarity that he had a larger mission. The mission just wasn't to rebuild the church physically and the churches that were falling apart, but it was to rebuild the church figuratively in the way it was preaching, the way it was political, the way that it was hypocritical to its mission. And he felt that he needed to be the voice, a loud voice in the community, in the area, to change people's perception of the church. So he had a public conversion, and that conversion was public in that they saw him begging, they saw him giving away his material things, and many thought he was insane, he went mad, and others looked at him with awe that he was able to release himself from the material and be married to the spiritual. Again, knowing that St. Francis came from the Bernardoni family, which had wealth and status, and he was willing to give all this up, and he was charismatic in the way that he was doing it, of course, and so he influenced some people, and he had some earlier followers. Those earlier followers worked with St. Francis to basically preach the word of penance and forgiveness. That was their main core message, to be humble, to forgive, and to do things for that forgiveness for things that they have done or people have done wrong. Moving on now to right around chapter 5. St. Francis saw that his order group, not an order yet, but his group was becoming large enough that he needed to seek some approval from authority. Even though he needed to rebuild the church, he also believed and understood in the power of the authority of the Catholic Church at the time, through the Pope all the way down through the bishops and Bishop Guido, which was the Bishop of Assisi. So he traveled with some friends to Rome, and through a number of circumstances and serendipity was able to meet with the Pope. The Pope had an affinity for St. Francis, and through that affinity, St. Francis was able to seek verbal approval to go out and preach the word, and he was deaconized. The only requirement was, as a symbol that he had authority through the church, was that he would get tonsured, which is cutting a ring around his head. He moved then to the river Tordo, the crook in the river outside the city walls, and basically lived on roots and begging, and prayed basically 24/7 with his now new followers or brothers. Again, having authority now so he wouldn't be viewed as a heretic at the time, St. Francis again went to grow his order, and they decided to move out after some people barged in. It was, there was the farmer and the jackass, looking for refuge as well, and he got frustrated, which he later repented for, but decided they needed a bigger place and sought refuge at a few churches that they were helping rebuild at the time. So now we're on chapter 6, and St. Francis decided that now we're big enough. We've got some momentum. We need some rules to guide us by, so his original mission and his original purpose isn't being lost on the others that are following him. So it's called the original orders, or the first orders. And those first orders were to be obedient, to worship and work, which are basically the same thing. Their full-time job was to pray, almost monastic monastic in how they went about their lives, meaning they couldn't really talk to each other. They were always constantly in prayer, or at least working. They took also, or part of the rules beyond obedience and work/worship was chastity, and then finally to be Catholic through and through. That's a very brief explanation of chapters 1 through 6. Of course, you'll need to fill in the details a little bit more, but those would be the types of questions and then answers that would be asked on the midterm, along with the lens that this class is being seen through, with all 5 Franciscan values, specific though to the ones that we just studied, which would be contemplation and hospitality. So you need to know something about both contemplation and hospitality, but you also need to be able to also fill in the blanks of the other 3 Franciscan values of service, integrity, and stewardship. Generally speaking, you need to know the general definition of marketing, which is create, communicate, and deliver a message of value. Marketing must do that as a strategic function, so people see a value in what they're giving up dollars for what they're getting, something either hedonic or utilitarian or both in nature for that exchange. Marketing's job is to do that mostly through some type of promotion in again, the strategic attempt to sell stuff. And you can only sell stuff if people see value in it for what they're giving up. We know that the role of business, when it's all said and done, is to make money, and they do that through the functional areas. Those functional areas, of course, are marketing, along with accounting, information technology, which is referred to IT, HR, which is human resource, management, and finance. Businesses need to listen to their market and hear voices, just like St. Francis heard voices. And so doing market research and understanding what the market wants and then giving that to them is an important part of what marketing does through their value-seeking proposition. Relationship marketing is tied to hospitality, in that if we want to develop a relationship with our market, we need to service them and understand them and speak to them and comfort them so we have repeat customers. That is really what hospitality is from a business / marketing point of view. We also talked about this feedback loop, where in order to gain a competitive advantage, we need to do something different or be innovative. And how can you be innovative? You have creativity, and the result of creativity is some type of innovation. How do you be creative? Well, through the act of contemplation, which is one of the values that we talked about. So to be contemplative leads to creativity, creativity leads to innovation, innovation leads to something different that we can tell a story about to our customers, hang value on, and make money, profitability. So that's that feedback loop that we talked about. We also talked a little bit about ethical marketing, that we want to make money, though, in an ethical way, either through the utilitarian or the Kantian lens. Either is an ethical, depending upon how you want to view it. But any way we look at it, the foundation of how we create, communicate, and deliver a message of value should be done through an ethical lens and not through this hedonistic appeal to do whatever we can to make a sale so we make money. That's not how we look at it, which would be related to our hedonism that we talked about in the Gali text, knowing that we have to hustle a little bit, though, because of competition and what's referred to as the abundance principle that we talked about, knowing that there's a lot of stuff out there, more stuff than demand, and therefore it requires businesses to do some things to sell their stuff. And the things they do should be creative in nature, but not unethical in nature. And finally, because businesses have a tendency sometimes to act unethically because of the abundance principle, they need to be checked. And we have business reform groups that do just that, consumer groups, the Better Business Bureau, government agencies, regulatory agencies that are created to prevent businesses to falling into the tendency to be hedonistic. Just like St. Francis was really a reform group in the Franciscans of the Catholic Church at the time. Again, general overview of what the midterm is going to be about. They will be short answer questions just like our quizzes. Make sure that you're going over the notes that are connected to the PowerPoints, they're connected to all the articles that we've handed out, the cases, and also, of course, the Golly text.